Thanks very much. My name's Jon Hurdle. I'm a freelance journalist. I've written pretty extensively about horseshoe crabs and related issues on the Delaware Bay shore, particularly. And I'd like to welcome you all here today to learn about horseshoe crabs. And we're going to be asking some overarching questions, the first of which is why we care about horseshoe crabs. These are superficially rather repellent creatures that have an awful lot of legs and are related to arachnids, in fact. And so we're going to be unpacking why we care about them and you know what the implications are. So we're also going to be looking at their status worldwide. I mean, there's a lot known about the American horseshoe crab, the one that's very numerous down here on nearby on Delaware Bay. Perhaps not so much. There are three other species elsewhere in the world, and we're going to be finding out about those. We're also going to be looking at the threats to horseshoe crabs, what the conservation strategies or the most successful conservation strategies might be. And then we're also going to be looking a bit about on the subject of public education and advocacy, why people get involved in things like tagging horseshoe crabs or just flipping them. And we're also going to be hearing something about that. So that's the overview of our program here today. Just a few words about myself. I have written as I said, I'm a freelance journalist. I've done quite a bit of my writing about horseshoe crabs and related issues for an outlet called New Jersey Spotlight News. I continue to write for them, but I've also written for the New York Times, for Delaware First Media. I think those are the three outlets that I've done my horseshoe crab work on, and I continue to look at it. And so I'm now going to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will get into the program. So first of all, Jo Marie Kasinak.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jo Marie. I'm an assistant teaching professor at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, and I'm also the director of Project Limulus, which is a long-term research initiative studying horseshoe crabs in the Long Island Sound.
Oh, that's me.
That's you.
I'm Glenn Gauvry. I'm the founder and director of the Ecological Research and Development Group. We've been around for, I guess, about 30 years. Our mission is the conservation of the world's 4 horseshoe crab species. I'm also one of the founding members of the IUCN Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group. And I guess that's about it.
So thanks, Glenn. So the first question we're going to ask are, what are the biggest threats to horseshoe crabs? And in no particular order here, we've got the bait harvest, the biomedical harvest, climate change, coastal development. There may be others as well, but my colleague Jo Marie is going to unpack that for us a bit.
Sure. So when I think about the main threats to horseshoe crabs, the two that definitely jump out to me are related to loss of suitable spawning habitat, which is connected to coastal development, as well as climate change issues like sea level rise and eroding shorelines. And then the second being that over-harvesting for either the biomedical or the fishing industry. So when we think about the biomedical aspect of it, horseshoe crabs are taken, if you guys don't know, they give a blood donation, and that blood is used to make something called Limulus amoebocyte lysate, which is used to test all vaccines and medical equipment here in the United States before it's administered to make sure that it's not contaminated with bacteria. The horseshoe crabs have this as part of their natural immunity, right? They have this property, this amoebocyte that clumps on contact with bacterial endotoxins. And so we've taken that and we've used it to make this test to keep humans safe. And so I always like to tell my people when I give talks, my people who come to visit us on the beach, if you've ever gotten a vaccine or anything, you can thank a horseshoe crab and for giving their blood to do the test for that, right? When we think about the fishing industry, horseshoe crabs are primarily harvested to be used as bait to catch other species, like eel or channel whelk, just other species that like to eat horseshoe crabs. There have been some synthetic baits that have been developed that aren't maybe as effective as using horseshoe crabs, so that's why they're still harvested there. And really one of the big ones is that spawning habitat. So horseshoe crabs need places to come up to the beach and lay their eggs. And if they don't have that habitat, whether it's a sandy beach or a marshy habitat, we find that they're actually not quite picky where they go, which is really nice. But they do need that habitat. And if we're building right to the edge of the water and putting up a seawall, there's no beach left for them to go to.
Picking up just for a second, Jo Marie, on your comments about the biomedical industry, do you want to talk a bit about the development of the synthetic alternative to LAL?
So I do know that it has been in the works for several years, trying to get a synthetic test made, and it has been created. But as of right now, it has not made it through the regulatory process that it needs in order to replace that horseshoe crab test, because it costs a lot of money, right? And so people are reluctant to make a switch. We have something that we know works. Why change it? The why is because of the conservation of the animal, but, doesn't always get through when we're talking about a multi-million-dollar industry.
Although the advocacy community for horseshoe crabs claims that an increasing number of pharmaceutical companies are adopting the synthetic alternative now, and of course, you might well ask, well, is this just wishful thinking on the part of the advocates? But I think that there's beginning to be evidence that that switch is occurring. And so what the advocates hope, of course, is that if pharmaceutical companies increasingly adopt the synthetic alternative, then that will translate into a reduced demand for horseshoe crabs. I think we're not at the point yet. I mean, this has only just been officially accepted by USP, the body that sets, it's a non-profit that sets scientific standards for the pharmaceutical industry. And so it's probably early days to be predicting an overall switch by the pharmaceutical industry, but as I said, the advocates are hoping that is beginning to happen now. Anyway, I would like to move on to the question of, what are the most effective strategies for conserving horseshoe crabs? And I'm hoping that Glenn can address some examples of successful international cooperation in that regard.
I'll do my best. I want to pick up, since we're talking we use the word international. So on the synthetics, what we got to also recognize is that pharmaceutical companies are multinational. So you've got whatever company you might have in New Jersey or in the United States, or also in China, India, and other places where they have a large market base. And they're producing very much the same things there as they're producing here. And so the harvesting of the three Asian horseshoe crab species for the same test is not done in the same manner as we harvest here. So the impact on those animals in Asia are much greater than the impact on the animals here. So it's a bigger issue than just local, because the pharmaceutical industry is not local, but our species may be. But in terms of the conservation strategies globally, we do a lot of work in Asia right now. We have been doing for quite some time, actually. But I'm just curious, how many in here have not seen a horseshoe crab in the wild? Can I see it? Everybody has. One person, okay. Great. And most of you, I'm assuming, are from the New York metropolitan area. Is that not everybody? Good. Couple not. Good. All right. It's just always helpful to kind of know.
Why they are endemic to this area?
Well, we do have a lot of them in this area, actually.
As opposed to other cities along the eastern seaboard.
Well, we have them all along the East Coast, from Maine all the way down to the Yucatan Peninsula. Actually, they go all the way down to, our species goes from Maine all the way down the coast. It goes around the Florida Panhandle, up as far as Mississippi, Louisiana. We've had some reports in Texas, but for the most part, we pretty much stop it at Mississippi. And then if you jump across the Gulf to the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, our species is there too, and that's the range of ours. The other 3 species go, for the most part, all the way from around the lower portion of Japan, and then you take it all the way through the Philippines and Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Vietnam, all the way to the Bay of Bengal.
Do they displace other sea lions? Do they displace other types of crab life?
Not in any kind of an aggressive manner, but everything tends to displace one another in some form or fashion. So in terms of strategies, when we look at it from a global point of view, there's different strategies for different areas. And so the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, for example, in the United States, sometimes there's controversy about whether they're only a harvesting, a management organization, and that's true, that is what they are. But if you look back over the last 20 years, you wanted to say what is the single most important thing that has helped horseshoe crabs in the United States recover, it would be the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission putting in regulations up and down the Atlantic coast having to do with those harvests. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, Glenn, but could you talk about, for a second about what their strategies have been, the way that the commission has sought to protect the horseshoe crab on the Delaware Bay, for example?
Well, the commission is represented by each of the states along the coast, and so each state has their own representatives that go to the commission. Early on, the challenge was when the population was in really severe decline in the late 70s and early 80s. The challenge was we just really didn't have enough data as to what a healthy population looked like. And so we started there. But as we started to get more and more data on that, we were able to start developing computer models that would help us to assess various inputs. So one of them, the one that they use now is called the Adaptive Resource Management Plan. And with that Adaptive Resource Management Plan, they can plug in what, say, the birding community feels is needed in terms of population abundance to protecting the red knot, for example, or they'll put in what the biomedical industry needs, what the watermen say they need up and down the coast. And all these various factors go into a model, and that model kind of crunches out and says, okay, we're doing well here, we could allow a little bit more harvest. We're not doing well here, we can't. So, for example, New York, we divide the East Coast into 6 regions, and most of the regions are stable or are recovering, except for the New York region. It's in decline. It continues to be in decline. And recently, as another strategy, the state of Connecticut, which Joe Marie's from, they instituted an all-out ban on the harvest of horseshoe crabs. There was a similar legislation put in front of the governor of New York, but it was vetoed. So New Jersey has an all-out ban. They've had it for a good number of years. Delaware does not. But the population in the Delaware Bay actually continues to grow, even though we have one state on one side with a ban and one state on the other side without. Yet in New York, in this region, the population continues to go down.
But can you talk about what the commission has done in terms of the female harvest?
Well, they've only done that in certain areas. So male and females are allowed to be harvested in most everywhere other than the Delaware Bay. The Delaware Bay, because it's a hemispheric location in terms of migrating shorebirds, has a lot of focus on it. And in the early days, all of the energy was put in the Delaware Bay in terms of conservation and understanding of what the horseshoe crab population needed to be. So one of the things that was adopted was to have a male-only harvest if you were going to harvest animals for bait, that they were going to leave the females alone. And that continues in place now. It was the Adaptive Resource Management Plan last year showed that there actually could be a female harvest, that the female population had recovered sufficiently enough to actually open up the harvest to females. But there was a lot of public outcry against that, and consequently, they decided to take that off the table. Unfortunately, what they did is they did kick the can down the road, so they're allowing Virginia and Maryland to harvest more animals because of taking the females off the table in the Delaware Bay. But at any rate, it's the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is an effective strategy for conservation here. There is no such unified governance in Asia for the three Asian species. You've got country by country, the way we have state by state, and they have different political situations. They're culturally different. And the uses are much more varied than we have here, so it becomes much more difficult to protect them there. But nevertheless, the IUCN Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group has made very strong inroads into Asia. We've held workshops in all the very hot spots. We now have an Asian horseshoe crab conservation plan that we have under development. We have an Asian horseshoe crab network, which you can find on Facebook if you look for it. It's very cool. They got a lot of great stuff. Our Indian partners are doing some wonderful work, as is some of ours in Indonesia. So there's a growing body of NGOs and scientific community that are starting to cobble together a plan that won't replicate what the AFMSC can do, because they've got authority and they've got enforcement capabilities, but it is starting to network out through Asia. So between what they're doing there that way and what we're doing here in a more regulated way, along with all the NGOs that are filling in the gaps, I think we're starting to have a picture of success here. The jury's still out as to where things are going to go in Asia.
Jo-Marie, can you explain the medical significance of the horseshoe crab?
Yeah, so so the biggest thing that we know horseshoe crabs for is their beautiful blue blood, which again is used to make that Limulus amoebocyte lysate test. And we did talk a little bit about the synthetic that is out there, but for the most part, there's still a pretty high demand for those horseshoe crab blood donations, if you will, in order to make that LAL. And like Glenn was saying, there is an equivalent over for the species in Asia, right? They make TAL, the Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate. But horseshoe crabs have also been studied for other reasons. Their eyes have been studied so that scientists can learn about the optic nerve, and they've also been used in some cancer research as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
So pretty long history of being used as a model organism in the medical field.
They replaced the rabbit, so that took a while to go from rabbit to horseshoe crab in the 70s. And so now we're looking to replace the horseshoe crab with synthetics. And it's actually going quite fast when you look at the amount of time it took to go from rabbit to horseshoe crabs. So, so soon, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we might not be having a conversation. We will be having this conversation because the biggest threat still exists, but we won't be having the conversation about the pharmaceutical industry, because more than likely they will have moved over to synthetics.
In Asia, is it a food source?
It is, yeah, and I think Jo-Marie is going to get into some more of the.
You probably can better than I can.
They eat them in Asia. And well, it's a status symbol in some places, so it depends on where you are in Asia. If you're in certain areas in China, if the cost of it, because it's hard to get, is up, then it ends up being more on the delicacy end of things, and that ends up being harvested for those purposes. But a good bit of South and Southeast Asia is in it where these animals are impoverished areas, or they're working class areas of like marine, they're fishermen and things like that. And it's a protein source, and it's a readily available protein source, and they don't have to pay for it. So there's a lot of harvesting and eating going on just for sustenance, not necessarily to make a dollar off of it. But then it is an easy animal to harvest, so there is a dollar to be made too.
Not here yet.
Please note that we will have a question and answer session at the end.
Yes, we will.
Right. So we also wanted to look at the areas of public engagement in the conservation of horseshoe crabs. And one of the things that comes to mind in my coverage of this issue has been once a year, every May, the horseshoe crabs come ashore to spawn on various beaches on the Delaware, on both sides of the Delaware Bay, and that event, thousands of horseshoe crabs coming ashore, is remarkably synchronized with the arrival of migratory shorebirds, particularly the red knot, as Glenn mentioned, which is a threatened species. And so the combination of those two things creates a significant natural spectacle. And as people have understood more about this this combined phenomenon, and I do remember various people have saying to me, well, this is North America's Serengeti. And even though it's actually significantly reduced now because the number of shorebirds visiting the Delaware Bay is a lot smaller than it used to be, it still attracts pretty good groups of dedicated, well, not only scientists but also volunteers from all over the world. And so on several occasions I've been on the New Jersey side of the Delaware Bay, and it's kind of to participate in this whole exercise of trapping the shorebirds, weighing them, measuring them, banding them in certain cases, and then letting them go. So all of that happens with when the horseshoe crabs are there. And one of the things that's been noticeable to me is, and I guess to a lot of people, is how willing people are to come and get involved in this. So not only do you get volunteers coming from all over the world to essentially camp out on the Delaware Bay shore for a couple of weeks every May, you get people will do basic things like, they've got a campaign called Just Flip 'em, and I think that Glenn can probably talk about that as well. And what Just Flip 'em means is simply horseshoe crabs get stranded and they get washed up in rocks, and they get washed up in salt marshes, and they're upside down, and unless they actually get some help in getting turned up the right way and allowed to go back into the ocean, then they'll die. So it's remarkable that how kind of popular that campaign has become. And there's also horseshoe crab tagging. I think, Jo Marie, you can talk a bit about that, right?
Yeah, so as part of what we do at Project Limulus, and this is something that we've replicated from lots of other organizations all along the East Coast, we participate in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's horseshoe crab tagging program. And so each year we get allotted a certain number of tags. What I do as the director is I have a large group of volunteers that reach out to me every year who want to help tag horseshoe crabs. We send tags out, and then we run our own events where I train my undergraduate students to be research interns. And we go and we bring people to the beach and get them involved with community or citizen science. It's been a really effective strategy for getting people involved, not only with their local community, but with actually participating in real life science, and then that helps increase their literacy. And by being involved in a program like this, we're finding that it has positive impacts on their stewardship. So if you go to the beach recreationally, and then you see all these people down there, and they're like, what are you guys doing? We're like, we're tagging horseshoe crabs, want to come help? And we talk to them, give them some of the fun facts about them, their blue blood, their living fossils, right, been around since the time of the dinosaurs, and why are they so important for human health, for the ecosystem, and for, all their connections to other species. So we've been doing that in the Sound for 27 years now, something like that, long time. And again, these programs are kind of all up and down the East Coast, these tagging programs. And I see at least one other horseshoe crab pin out in the audience. If you guys ever find a tagged horseshoe crab that has one of those U.S. Fish and Wildlife tags, if you report it where you were the tag number, you get a thank you from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that sometimes, if they have the funding, comes with a little pewter horseshoe crab pin, which people wear with pride. Or you can buy them, like I did, for a scholarship fund for students. So getting people involved with that community science has been really important. And what I've found in my years working with horseshoe crabs is that even though they're maybe not the most charismatic, like John was saying, like, we think of the panda bear, or like the white tiger or whatever. People love them, and people come out, they really do, to come learn about them and come support them. And thinking about the other way to engage, I've been working on a marine social science project to try to see how these experiences maybe help influence us as who we are as humans, right? So we have all these connections to our environment, to the ecosystem, to these animals, and that shapes us in some way. And so if you guys have any interest in that, come talk to me after. Ocean Identity, okay, little plug.
So one sign of the degree of public interest in horseshoe crabs, I think, is a program of coastal sanctuaries that Glenn's got going down in Delaware. Do you want to talk about that, Glenn?
Yeah, actually, a number of years ago, 1998, we started the Just Flippin' program, and really the program wasn't about collecting data as to how many horseshoe crabs we've saved. Really, the program was about generating compassion for the animal. So when you approach this animal, and rather than walking by it with indifference, when you help it, then you all of a sudden become connected to it. And it becomes much easier to walk by the next one and the next one. And as you start to help them, and then you all of a sudden have a friend that comes in from out of town and they're walking the beach with you, and you flip over a horseshoe crab and they ask you why you did it, and you explain, now you're an educator. And so this program grew that way to a point where it started to make sense to ask the communities, because most of these animals are spawning in people's backyards. They're not going to state and federal wildlife refuges. They might be there too, but by and large, they're coming up where the habitat's suitable, and quite often it's people's backyards. So we started going after the communities in these areas and seeing if we could get them collectively to get behind the idea that they were going to be stewards of this resource and call themselves a community-based horseshoe crab sanctuary. So we have 11 of them now, protecting over 20-some miles of some of the most pristine horseshoe crab spawning habitat in the world. So, but they dovetail together. The Just Flip 'em and the sanctuary programs are kind of connected that way.
We've got about 1 minute until the audience Q&A section is supposed to start, but I've also been asked to say a couple of words about communication here, and particularly about how my reporting on the whole horseshoe crab issue may have helped the cause. When the organisers of this event asked me to talk about this when we had a planning call a couple of weeks ago, I said, well, I really didn't know the answer to that, because I'm not aware that any of my stories have been responsible for changes in policy or increases in public support or anything like that. But I did recently hear from somebody in a non-profit that represents the horseshoe crab who claimed that that it's actually important to be able to communicate to communicate these ideas, which can be kind of scientific and a bit dry and a bit remote, in ways that people can understand. And so apparently, the general media's reporting on this issue has apparently had some positive effects, and so we'd be interested in any feedback on that. So we'd like to open the floor now to any questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Two quick questions. I used to tag the horseshoe crab. I hated to drill holes in them and get a blast. But I want to know, what have we learned from all the tagging? I hate to tag things and then not get enough information. And the second one is sea level rise. We're losing all our shorelines. How are the horseshoe crabs going to fare with that?
Yeah, well, good, but two good questions. Jo Marie, can you address the tagging?
Sure. So thinking locally, what we found with Project Limulus in Connecticut, our tagging data has answered so many questions for us. We've learned that most of the horseshoe crabs that we tag tend to stay within Long Island Sound, but not always, right? They are migratory, which has led to interesting management conversations, because if we're tagging horseshoe crabs in Connecticut that are going to end up in Maine and New Jersey, and we say, yeah, it's totally fine to harvest our population, but is it really our population of horseshoe crabs, right? Or are they also crossing the Sound to New York where they're allowed to be harvested, right? So interesting conversations there. We've seen that like year to year, about 50% of the horseshoe crabs tagged at a beach will stay there, and the other 50% move east or west within a 5-kilometer range, sorry. And so that's been really interesting. It's allowed us to look at the sex ratios of the crabs. We tend to have about 40% 40% females to 60% males. And those trends are fairly common from what I've heard in Delaware Bay as well. We've been able to track when they're coming up to the beaches to spawn and learn that it's really temperature dependent, and that's helped us, again, target our activities when we're going to come find the crabs. So we answer a lot of different ecological questions with it. I will say now we do primarily use the tagging program as an outreach, a way to get people to the beach. We don't use like the drill, we use an awl to make a little hole, and I do promise that it heals up very quickly. And I always say to like students when I'm with them, if they have their ears pierced, right, it's kind of like that, maybe they like bothers them for a second. But I've also tagged horseshoe crabs that were digging holes to mate, and they just kept digging holes to mate, like they didn't even stop, right? So that's
They
like
were males.
yeah, just like just hanging out, just like didn't matter. So that answers that first part. And the second was
Well, the second one was about sea level rise. And
Sea level rise.
I'm wondering, Glenn, if you
I'll
if
take a
you're
stab
finding
at
it
it.
on, in any of your sanctuaries whether they are being inundated, those beaches.
Well, I've seen horseshoe crabs all over the world. I mean, I haven't been to India yet. That's next on my list. But it is going to affect them, but it isn't necessarily going to. One of the things that affects them from sea level rise is how we harden our coastlines. So we harden our coastlines to protect what we think is valuable to us, and it ends up having an adverse effect to animals that actually need that coast. So, like down in Delaware, we've got, if you go down in the bay, there's a community near where we're at called Pickering Beach, for example. And we're outside of where the 50 or so houses are that are desperately trying to make sure they don't lose any more of their beach. And as a result of it, the horseshoe crabs are spawning up underneath the houses because they'll continue to go up as the beach recedes. But if you go further up from that beach, only eighth of a mile, there's nothing blocking that. So as the Phragmites all starts to get destroyed and the detritus tends to kind of wash around and the sand kind of blows up. And next thing you know, you find the following year you've got horseshoe crabs up there where before they were here. And in that area, because it happens to be a refuge, they could continue to go further and further up as we lost more and more beach and the houses a little bit further down were no longer there. So that will give them some little wiggle room as things start to rise if we're not constantly hardening our coastlines and preventing that recession from going on in a more natural way. What's going on right now is just highly unnatural. But I've seen that just about everywhere I've gone. It's the same issue. Wherever there's an area where the coastline can recede, the horseshoe crabs will tend to go further in. Wherever there's an area where they've bulkheaded or some sort of hardening mechanism, then they end up having to move further down. And not always further down as a suitable spawning habitat, or the waters off from further down is a suitable nursery habitat. So it's both marine and terrestrial we have to be paying attention to.
I will say that we have been participating in some kind of like latitudinal studies looking at spawning habitat for horseshoe crabs. We are finding them spawning in salt marshes as well. And so at least one of the people on that project has an idea that maybe that's what's helped them survive over time, because if we look through geologic history, this isn't the only time when we've had higher sea levels, right? So where were the horseshoe crabs spawning then? But like Glenn was saying, there was nothing preventing the shoreline from moving, right? And that's what you see in the geological record is the shoreline receding and coming back. And so I know that you mentioned before that New York has a lot of bedrock, so does Connecticut. At some point, our marshes have nowhere else to retreat. And so we might see them, horseshoe crabs, not being able to survive locally in Long Island Sound anymore for a while, but maybe they're able to move elsewhere where there is that suitable habitat. Great
Other
question.
questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I have a few questions, Thank you. You said very nicely that there's the horseshoe crabs give donations of their blood. Is there any way to do the whole medical thing without them having to pass away in the process, or is it always them having to be killed?
So, from my understanding, it's about 30% of their blood that is taken when they do that, and then they're released into the wild. And so it's a 10 to 30, maybe 40% mortality rate of the crabs that give that donation. So it's not a complete drain. However, if you took 30% of my blood, I would not be doing well. So I think it's all in perspective, you know. But yeah, so it depends. Not all of them survive it, but it's, you know, if it's a good day, then 90% survive the process. So that's great.
Well,
Yep, so it's been argued all the ways, right? Take less, bleed them completely. Take more, bleed less. This is kind of what the standard. Glenn, do you know if there's some more nuance there?
Well, one of the things that we overlook, because we always constantly focus on our species in our backyard, is that the 3 other Asian horseshoe crab species are bled to death. So we harvest our horseshoe crab, and I don't like the word donation because I think that's a voluntary process. But,
yes.
But at any rate, we harvest our horseshoe crabs, we bleed them, and then we release them. And so there is mortality associated with that process for sure. But for TAL, that is used in the pharmaceutical industry for the same endotoxin test in Asia, those animals are bled to death. So that's 100% mortality. So it just to broaden your thinking
the
about
advocates
about that.
in terms of the overall threats to horseshoe crabs, the advocates will point out that the biomedical industry, let's say that their practices result in 20% mortality. Conservationists say, well, you know, that may be accurate, but then there are probably others that are unable to breed because some portion of their blood has been removed. But on the other side of the coin, you've got the bait industry, which is 100%, in which the mortality rate is 100%. But I think you were asking, ma'am, if there's any there's an alternative to bleeding the horseshoe crabs. I mean that goes back to the development of the synthetic endotoxin test, which, as I said, is being developed and has been officially approved now. So we're hopeful that that's going to. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. We only have a few minutes left now. Somebody at the back.
Yeah, she's got the mic.
Yeah, Leslie.
Oh, okay. Hi. Our little corner over here is the Jamaica Bay Wetlands Fellows, so we have the pleasure of regularly interacting with horseshoe crabs this season.
Cool.
My question, though, was as far as like dredging throughout New York Harbor goes, how is that affecting horseshoe crab populations, positive or negative?
Can either of you answer that one?
It is affecting them. I mean, any dredging project is disrupting the benthic community. So with your juveniles, I'm not as familiar with Jamaica Bay and Long Island Sound. I know Jo Maria is, but it's similar. In Delaware, we have a very shallow bay. So when these animals hatch out, they stay in the shallows. And they only actually go deeper as they get older. So when they molt out and they get larger, they go for a larger food resource, and they'll ultimately go themselves out to the channel. But initially, they're staying in shallower waters because the food resource is more appropriately sized and the predation is less. So if you start to disrupt that bottom, or you're taking material from one area to dump onto the beach, then you're affecting not only the beach. We've found that it takes a couple of years before the spawning on the productivity on the beach ends up being the way it was before sand was put on it. But we also are always concerned about what we've done to the benthic community that the juveniles are depending upon for growth. So the short answer is yes, it does have an impact. What impact it has in your particular area, that would have to be studied. But you're also stirring up a lot of contaminants. And so you could be having, heavy metals that were nice and everybody was leaving them alone, and now all of a sudden they're in the water column and they're being ingested, and then they're being ingested by the small animals. So there's been studies in Tokyo on that. Actually, there's been a lot of studies in Japan on that. Unfortunately, a lot of the studies are in Japanese, but the data is out there on those effects.
I think I saw some more hands there. Ma'am. Yes. Hi.
Thank you. This is so interesting. So thank you, first of all. But my question, I'm not very familiar with horseshoe crabs, and I was wondering if you guys could explain some of the benefits and services they provide to the larger ecosystem and why you have named them marine champions.
Well, I could start off by I think one of the probably the best known service that the horseshoe crabs perform in the Delaware Bay is feeding migratory shorebirds, because that's as I said, the spawning of the horseshoe crab is remarkably synchronized with the arrival of the shorebirds, and particularly the red knot. And so there are the red knot it's a very long distance shorebird, and it has only a small number of staging areas on its migratory path, which for the longest flying birds starts in southern Argentina, a place called Tierra del Fuego, and they all go to their breeding grounds in the Canadian Arctic. So it's a very long migration, and probably the biggest. I mean, this may be beginning to change now, but traditionally the biggest, the most important staging area is for that species is the red knot, and that species is dependent on the eggs of the very fat, rich eggs of the horseshoe crab, in order to regain weight and continue its migration, because it has about another 3,000 miles to migrate in order to get to its breeding grounds. And so that's one particular bird species which has attracted tremendous publicity, and many people know about the red knot. But there's other shorebirds as well that are also sustained by the horseshoe crab, and it's also, it would not be accurate to say that the horseshoe crab only feeds migratory birds. It feeds a whole sort of ecological community, and so I think that is one way of talking about its ecological value. Glenn.
There's another way. It does feed a lot of things, but I always try to look at value beyond what it gives in terms of sacrifice. And it's a benthic critter, so I don't know how many of you do gardening, but if you got a good garden and you got a lot of worms in the garden, and those worms help aerate the soil and make the soil healthy, these animals are constantly moving around on the bottom, and they're constantly churning it up. They're constantly making that bottom a more active and alive environment for everything else that lives there. So that's one of the things. But the part that, ERDG does what it does, not because of what this animal does for everybody else. We started this organization as being an advocate for the horseshoe crab because it actually had no voice. Everybody else had interest in it for what it did for something else. So if you look at an animal that's been around for 450 million years and you ask why it's still here today, it's here today because it learned very early how to harmonize with the environment it depended upon for survival. That's a model. That's a model that we don't have. That's a model that most animals don't have. So its value to us should be its longevity and how it managed to do it for that long successfully.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We just have a couple of minutes left. I want to take one or two more questions if I could. Anyone else? Somebody at the back there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Having only ever worked with the Atlantic horseshoe crab and never actually seen any of the Pacific species in person, I was just wondering, other than the geographical distribution, are there any major differences morphologically, ecologically, or anything like that?
the mangrove species actually is toxic during certain times of year, and local communities know when to harvest them and eat them, and others don't, and people die every year from doing that. Their shape is very different too. So I mean that one jumps out of the three because of that issue right there. The other two, the coastal and the tri-spine, are very similar, different in terms of certain body part shapes, but other than that, pretty similar. But the mangrove species is the one that jumps out as being remarkably different in that regard.
Jeremy, did you want to? I think you had another question, ma'am. I don't know. Somebody at the back there. Yes, yes, sir.
Just going off of that last question, you talked about them being essential to the bird species and their migratory pattern. Is there an invasive species that interrupts their spawning, or is there something that we should raise awareness or be aware of that's harming, whether it's flora or fauna? Like is the Phragmites interfering with their breeding grounds? Is there something we should be aware of that we should also try to just lower its population or be mindful of it, if not lower?
Well, I'm not aware of any invasive threat to the horseshoe crab. Either of you?
They have a parasite that lives in their gills called the Limulus leech. It's a flatworm. You guys, if you tag horseshoe crabs, have seen them, whether or not you know it or not. But they're the little white gooey things all over them. And so in recent years, we've been looking into that more, but they co-evolved with the horseshoe crab, so they're only found in the horseshoe crab gills. I think, like we've discussed, the biggest threats are going to be those anthropogenic ones, right? So people.
Yeah, Homo sapiens. Yeah, yes, sir.
Not invasive, but some of the gulls, like the great black-backed gull and herring gulls, have learned to turn them over and eat the gills.
Yeah, the gulls eat them. Yeah, in Connecticut, we don't really have migratory shorebirds eating horseshoe crab eggs, but we see the Canada goose going on top of the nests and disturbing them to make the eggs float up and eat them. They kick their feet and stir up the sediment and then eat the eggs. Yeah.
Right there.
So you mentioned sea temperature, or I wanted to ask about how rising sea temperatures might be affecting their populations as well, whether it's sex ratio or just when they show up.
Yeah, for the most part, from what I've seen, it's mostly just been earlier start to the spawning season. Yeah, maybe an extended season if it stays warm enough, but no huge negative impacts. And I think what we have to remember is that the horseshoe crab is just a wildly generalist species, right? Like Glenn was saying, they really have evolved to live in harmony with their environment, and we see them from Maine down to the Yucatan Peninsula, down in Florida, right, where it's warmer, they have shallower, lower tides. There's all these different things, right? Yeah, there's all and then also the Asian species. So they're able to live in these areas with different temperatures, with different, pressures. So far, temperature has not been a huge negative impact, at least, right? Yeah, one more, go ahead.
Are they missing what?
In the Gulf of Mexico, that area where we don't find them. Do you know why?
No, we don't know why. I mean, the Gulf is pretty deep, and that's part of the reason. It's mainly how they moved around. So we don't have them in Cuba, for example, and in other places in the Caribbean that you would think that if you have them in the Yucatan, you should, but you don't. We don't have them on the West Coast because it's too deep. On the East Coast, we've got the continental shelf. You go over to Asia, it's a similar sort of thing, where they've got that shelf, they've got horseshoe crabs. Where they don't, they don't.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
All right, Glenn, I'm sorry to put this on
Uh-oh.
to you, but again, give us a take on the possibility of the horseshoe crab being an edible commodity here in the U.S.
It won't happen.
Why?
They taste awful. I mean, if you were culturally brought up eating, I mean, there's a lot of things that we, yeah, no, this isn't like that.
Here in Southeast
They eat the eggs mostly. It's mostly females. They will steam the female and they'll eat her on the half shell with the eggs. It's the eggs that have the protein in it, but there is some meat. But no, they taste really quite bad.
All right.
But who knows?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sorry. One quick.
Shameless promotion that we have a horseshoe crab festival at the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge.
Oh, good. All right.
You won't get any argument from them.
This Sunday at 10 o'clock.
Oh.
If you send me
All right.
something, I'll put it on our.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well,
Thank
thank you all very much for your attention. And
Thank you all.